Broadcasting from Silicon Valley, California, this is Conversations with Jennylyn.
My guest today is not a stranger. He was on not so long ago discussing a book he has written on Rosie Douglas. And he actually has the physical book in his presence today. So I thought it would be nice to bring him back so we can talk about the book. And he is Superior Court Judge, Dr. Irving André. Irving, welcome back.
Welcome. Thank you very much for the invitation, Jennylyn. I'm honored that you've asked me to come back on your show. And again, let me express my my well wishes to your listeners and those who follow your program. You're doing an excellent service to the community, and I wish to commend you for doing so.
Thank you so very much. Now, the last time we spoke, you went into detail about the book, but for somebody who has not had the opportunity to watch that segment, do you want to do a recap and then you can show us the book?
Sure. For someone who knows virtually nothing about Rosie Douglas, let me indicate in a few sentences. Rosie Douglas is best known for being the Prime Minister of the Commonwealth of Dominica, a former British colony in the Eastern Caribbean, for 9 months from January of 2000 to October the 1st, 2000, when he died very suddenly to the great not anger, but to the great sorrow of tens of thousands of persons, not only in Dominica, but all over the world. Rosie had come to the attention of persons in the diaspora after he migrated to Toronto, Canada, on about 1961. He had gravitated, after doing a degree in agriculture, he had done a bachelor's degree in political science, and he became involved in the Black Power movement in Montreal in the mid to late 60s. That involvement culminated in a riot at the Sir George Williams University in February of 1969. He was one of the leaders of that incident. Suffice it to say that he was tried and convicted, and he spent some 18 months in custody. He was released towards the fall of 1973. He remained in Toronto, became intimately involved in the struggle for civil rights in Toronto until his departure from Toronto and from Canada in April of 1976. He ultimately returned to Dominica, where he became very much involved in the struggle for political independence, which culminated in Dominica getting national independence in November of 1978. After an unsuccessful attempt to run for political office in 1980, he became involved in the Libyan internationalist movement called the Mathaba. And in that capacity for a number of years, he assisted a number of liberation movements in South America, in Africa, and in the Caribbean. He was able to organize training for those belonging to some of these liberation movements. He was able to organize and to obtain financial assistance to them. He was also very much involved in the Eastern Caribbean islands, embracing Fidel Castro. After a disastrous hurricane in Dominica in 1979, August 29th to be exact, he arranged for the non-aligned movement to donate millions of dollars to Dominica and to give scholarships to Dominican students. Suffice it to say that before he died, he was responsible for hundreds of Dominican students studying in Cuba and in other parts of the world, even in Guyana and some other European countries. In 1992, he became the head of the Dominica Labour Party. He won a seat in the parliament. I should indicate that he previously won a seat in 1985, but lost that seat in 1990. He won a seat in the Dominican legislature in 1995. He ultimately led his party to the victory in 2000. He had a broad vision for the island. He had a vision where Africans in the diaspora would see Dominica as an oasis, a place they could visit, a place they could make contributions. He had a vision of having Dominica being a technological mecca for the region. He had a vision of giving honorary Dominican citizenships to African Americans. In fact, before he died, he was supposed to be a presenter at the Million Family March organized by Louis Farrakhan in October, I believe, of the year 2000. He tried to forge a closer relationship with France. Dominica, as you know, geographically speaking, sits between two French departments, Guadeloupe and Martinique. And there's always been significant historical connections between Dominica and these two French neighbors. So against the political wisdom at the time, he sought to forge a closer relationship with France because of Dominica's proximity to these two islands. And many Caribbean leaders derided him for, from their perspective, reintroducing colonialism to the region. But he had this broader vision and sweep of history. He had a vision of the diaspora forging links together. Persons coming, invested in Dominica, persons with a similar history, with a similar historical experience. And he had this broad vision. And suffice to say, when he died prematurely, that created a significant vacuum in Dominica's political leadership.
Did you ever meet him?
Oh, absolutely. In 1976, when Rosie came back, he organized a number of committees called the Popular Independence Committees. I was a student then. I was part of one of those committees in Roseau called the Vanguard, actually called Cadre Number 1. That was the name. We published a newspaper, and that is where my writing career commenced. There's one gentleman who I was very close to, although he was younger than I, Gabriel Christian, who's now an attorney in Maryland, the United States. We published a newspaper called the Vanguard. Others were involved, but we played the seminal role in it and so on. And we were very much involved in trying to propagate socialist views among the young electorate in Dominica and so on. And we certainly played a modest role in that movement. When Rosie came triumphantly to Toronto in May of 2000, I chaired the meeting where he met hundreds of Dominicans. And in his typical inimitable fashion, he gave a scintillating presentation to Dominicans about conditions in the island and about his vision for Dominica's future. Not only that, but I had some knowledge of the family because I grew up in Dominica's second town called Portsmouth. Spent 10 years there before my family moved to Roseau, the capital. And I'd gone to school with a few of his younger siblings, and I knew the family very well. I also, I should indicate, assisted in Rosie's eldest sister in writing a book about her father. So I knew the family very well, and that gave me an inner track in terms of writing a biography of Rosie. I was fortunate when I started writing this biography on about 2019, although I had done interviews many years before, I was able to link up, so to speak, with many persons who'd been involved with Rosie in the activism of the 70s. In fact, one of the persons I was fortunate to have met is a compatriot of yours. Her name is June Ward, a retired UN economist who was also involved in activism in Toronto in the 70s. She proved to be a significant source of information. I was able to meet persons who had interacted with him, persons who had assisted him. So this book gives an insights about Rosie, not only from his family members, but from persons who had a close relationship with him going back into the late 60s and the 70s. And I also benefited from being the repository of a number of photographs about Rosie. In fact, the book has 70 pages, 70 pages of photographs of him spanning his whole life, from the time before he left Dominica in 61 to some of his work in Montreal in the 60s, to his activism in the 70s, and the work he did in Dominica from 1976 onwards until his untimely death.
Do you know if any other books have been written, or is this the first
No,
book that's been
this
written?
is the first biography of Rosie.
Wow.
Chances are, no, there's been articles written, particularly about the riot, which I alluded to earlier, in which he's mentioned and so on. But this is the first biography written of him. And again, once hopefully the COVID crisis dissipates, I will be able to access even more information about him and write a second volume about some aspects of his life that I couldn't cover, at least not in the detail that I would have liked, on account of the limitations on travel because of COVID-19.
I must ask you this question.
Sure.
Hope you don't think it's impertinent, but what?
It's never impertinent, yes.
Okay, so what drove you to do this book? Where
What
did
drove
you
me?
drive to do all of the research? Clearly, you have a lot of respect for him, but where did the drive? You're a very busy judge. So where did you find the time, or where did the drive come from to do this book?
Great question, and I thank you for asking. Perhaps I will describe that drive by reference to a saying of Martin Luther King, which a few years ago.
Who you remind me of, by the way. You are a lighter version of, I wanted to tell you this before, that you remind me of him for some reason.
Well, it was popularized by Obama. It is, simply put, it goes that the fierce urgency of now. As you know, America has had to come into terms with a racial reckoning on account of what happened last evening. And before I studied law, I was involved, or I was in a PhD program in history at Johns Hopkins. I completed 2 years of that program before I blundered into Canada. So I've always had this historical bent. In 1992, Gabriel Christian, the attorney in Maryland, and we founded a little modest press, because we felt that if we don't take the lead in writing about our island's history, no one will come riding on a white horse to do it for us. So we started doing research, particularly during the time that I lived in Baltimore, Maryland from 82 to 84. So every month end, I would travel by bus to Maryland, and Mr. Christian and I would spend hours at the Library of Congress researching their archives for any information about Dominic. We would photocopy it and we'd develop our own research materials.
Impressive.
Absolutely. And that was the basis on which in 1992 we published our first joint book called In Search of Eden, The Travails of a Caribbean Mini-State. We did a revised copy a few years afterwards. But from that book, we have both written a number of books. We've assisted other persons in publishing their own books. We are not professionals. And obviously, we've had difficulties because we're just a small two-man operation, nothing fancy. But we felt that there was an urgency in documenting that history because, as I said, the interest from someone with little or no connection to Dominica would be conspicuous by its absence. And that was the motivation for us. Yeah. The belief that our history is important, that we have a story to tell, and more importantly, that we should attempt as best as we can to tell our stories. As I said to you, much has been written about that riot in February of 1969. But what struck me is that there was, although in many of the press reports I read and many articles I read, it emerged that Rosie Douglas played a leading role. I found that there had hardly been, except for some interviews after he became prime minister in 2000, much hadn't been written on him exclusively. So I took it upon myself to, first of all, to do the research by looking at the newspaper accounts.
Can you hold it up for us?
Oh, sure, absolutely.
Yeah.
It's a fairly voluminous book. It's about.
And where are people going to find it, Irvin?
I will have it on Amazon shortly. It will be in Dominica and a bookstore too in Toronto. But anyone who's desirous of getting a copy can directly or indirectly send me a message either by WhatsApp or email or whatever it is, and I can make it available. The process of disseminating it or marketing it has been slowed on account of the COVID crisis. But again, the important thing is that we document those stories because although we are small from a geographic perspective, in my view, that we've made a significant contribution to the discourse on liberation, on activism, on equality, and the world has to know, has to appreciate the contributions that we've made. So that was the primary justification for documenting the life of this extraordinary man, not a perfect man by any stretch, but the fact of the matter is, given what he sacrificed to make a contribution, as you know, he was from a very prominent Dominican family. He came up and he had the opportunity to become involved in mainstream politics. He had an opportunities to become, for example, a member of one of the traditional professions, law, and even to seek a position as a parliamentarian. But he gave all that to become involved and immersed in Black activism in the 1960s and in the 70s. So his story speaks to us in a significant fashion. It speaks to us in a significant fashion at this particular juncture when in North America, in Europe, the world is being forced to confront issues that historically we found it difficult to come to terms with. So in my view, no better time could be than now for this book. And I should indicate that I've been reassured and quite pleased with the responses to the book thus far. And a couple of university libraries have contacted me seeking copies of it. One professor has contacted me and even inquired about reprinting the book. So far, so good. It's not the type of book which will become an overnight bestseller. But then again, I have no interest in writing that type of book. My interest is to write about these overlooked spaces from a historical perspective.
Mm-hmm.
That's my
He clearly played a part and fought for his causes.
Oh, absolutely. And he sacrificed tremendously. The scorn of his father and criticisms from other persons and so on. But here was one who maintained a strong grip on his own vision. And he made a significant contribution, as I argue in the book.
So what was the most challenging part of putting this book together?
The most challenging part is to tease information out of certain individuals. The fact of the matter is, he was put under surveillance in Canada, in Toronto in the 70s. There are many persons who actually kept their distance from him after he became persona non grata. And as I indicated earlier in the interview, he was eventually deported in 76. But as early as 1973, the Canadian government served notice that they intended to do so. they assigned an African American to surveil him. Warren Hart is his name, from a Black Panther from the United States. And it's only towards the end of the 70s, in an inquiry into the activities of the RCMP, the Royal Canada Mounted Police, that it was publicly revealed that this fellow was on the RCMP's payroll, and his task was to report to the RCMP of the movements and activities of Rosie Douglas. So getting information from certain persons who had personal knowledge of what transpired was somewhat difficult, because many persons still fear being implicated, although frankly nothing can happen to them from a legal perspective. So I had to overcome that challenge, and but that was quite frankly the
How did
most.
you get around it? Did you eventually get it?
I eventually got it. As I said, I met some persons who were quite forthright, who were very much interested in seeing the story of Rosie written about.
Uh-huh.
And for that, I was very thankful. And as I said, I have a compatriot, his name is Ian Carrington, who was almost like an assistant to Rosie, and June Ward, who knew him very well for over 30 years, almost 30 years, were very, very helpful. And Miss Ward was kind enough and was conscious enough that she kept a lot of documentation, primary sources about their activities. So she was probably one of the most helpful persons I met in terms of persons who contributed to this book. So I was fortunate in that I benefited from information gleaned from these sources.
So are you worried about yourself that you have put all of the details out there?
No, there's nothing to.
No, you've
Yeah,
tried to
sorry.
publish the truth. So
There's nothing to worry about, really. Again, as I said, this is an opportune time. The issue of race is something that has to be dealt with on a very frank basis, honest basis. And obviously, there'll always be people who would be less than forthright in dealing with those issues. But we have to deal with it because we're human beings. We should all be equal. And we have to confront our past. And if we don't know our past, then how can we achieve the goal, the laudable goal of equality, without being informed by that past? So it's imperative to me that our generation, not our generation, the generation after our, become fully aware and apprised of the struggles of the past, so they themselves can be motivated and animated to make a significant contribution themselves, because this is the world they will inhabit, and they have to be confident, march boldly. They do not have to be fettered by any feelings of inferiority or second-class status. They have to be animated by a desire to resist any attempts at othering, which many of them will encounter at some point in their lives. So it's imperative that we tell our stories and we document as best as we can the struggles of the past.
Honestly.
Mm-hmm.
So, the thing is, the world is plagued with so much prejudice. And when I speak with African Americans, and I am African American, I'm so many different ethnicities. And now in California, where I live, I've noticed that there's been a lot of aggression toward Asians. So it shifted a little bit from African Americans now to Asians, because supposedly they brought COVID into the world. I'm told this is the reason behind the aggression. And someone was teasing me yesterday because they say, Jenny, you identify as a Black woman, but you look like an Asian woman. You cannot escape the aggression. You better make sure the people know, that they're not supposed to kill you because you look Asian. And I think it really made me realize that there's so much prejudice. It's not just with Black people or Asian people. It's from ignorance. It
Well,
is
that's right.
being uneducated and from having ideas in your head about people and situations that are just that, ideas, and then people act upon them. And so how do we change that? Because
Well,
people choose to remain in that ignorance.
we change that by, again, as I said, becoming conscious of the troubled past, by playing our roles. And not all of us can become political leaders, but in our own way, playing our roles in advancing the discourse of equality. You see, at certain historical junctures, racialized individuals have always become the scapegoat, for particular during economic downturns, and they've been persecuted, they've been singled out, and I don't need to tell you that America has had its own history. Canada also, England also, and obviously Europe. But we have, it seems to me, as persons who are blessed with a certain degree of intelligence, we have, in my respectful view, the unique opportunity of setting an example, of taking advantage of the opportunities that exist, of educating those with whom we've had the privilege of calling our children, of speaking to as many young persons. Because what is success if it is not the extent to which you have nurtured younger minds and souls to become successful and to make a contribution to the less fortunate? You see, if we adopt that attitude that we are our brother's keeper, whatever you do to the least of my brothers, that you do unto me. If you adopt that biblical admonition and you go out there with a view to making a difference, if we do that on a collective basis without any apologies to anyone, can you imagine what type of world we'll be living in today?
I can, but do you believe that there are people that are very educated, probably on the same level as you are? It does not matter how much education they have blocks around that.
Oh, and you're absolutely
Sadly, and sadly, that's what makes me sad.
you're absolutely correct. And many of our persons from our community have found that to their chagrin, that education or even your possession doesn't insulate you from those feelings of animosity based on your color of your skin. In America, that has become evident to famous, successful basketball players, professionals, and so on. So there's no insulation, there's no silo which can protect us from those feelings of animosity generated by racial prejudice. So that is why it's imperative that we play our contribution. That is why it's imperative that we do not adopt some type of conceited perspective that because we've achieved professionally, we're not one of them. That is why it's important.
Exactly. Because I'll tell you right now that I know many people who don't know exactly what my ethnicity is and will say things to me that have really stunned me because I wouldn't think those people would feel that way. And so what I've learned is it doesn't matter how educated you are, the prejudice exists, not just against Black people or Asian people, but against religion, against so many different things. But some people, they have these blockages for whatever reason, And I don't ever think they will ever overcome them. And what makes me very sad is if you are someone who is well learned and you feel this way, then it explains why we continue to have the separation we have in the world over religion, over color, over whatever. And it makes me wonder if we will ever overcome those barriers.
Well, let me give you an analogy. Chances are we will never be able to find a cure for all cancers, but that doesn't mean that we have to stop trying.
That's true.
And bear in mind also that every journey begins with a first step, you know? So although the goal may be far afield, but we do not have the luxury of not pursuing, that glittering city on the hill, to use a metaphor from one of your presidents. We have to continue working towards achieving that goal. And we have to be able to say with confidence that the world our children will live will be in search of their own opportunities. We have to make it our business to make sure that that's a better world than we had to contend with when we were at their age. That is what we have to do as a community.
I said to someone who does not know that I have black blood, who was making a black comment to me, what would you do if you saw people with their skin peeled away? Would you feel that same way?
Mhm.
And
Well, you know what?
that person looked at me. I didn't get an answer. And we're almost out of time. We're down to the last 3 minutes.
Yes.
I want to make sure we include in this segment everything
Mm-hmm.
you want people to know about this book and why you encourage them to read it, apart from the fact that you wrote it.
Well, this book speaks to a number of different issues: the struggle for racial equality, the development of a small former British colony in the Eastern Caribbean. It speaks to the issue of racial equality in the 60s and in the 1970s. It speaks to the issue of the contribution of someone who was born with the proverbial silver spoon, but who to a significant degree sacrificed his privileged heritage to become an advocate for the less fortunate. So it speaks to the human condition in a very fundamental way.
Mm-hmm.
It transcends race, it transcends national boundaries. It speaks to the human condition. And that is what I derive from the life of this fantastic individual.
You know what is really sad about that? Inevitably, almost everyone that I know of who has chosen that path ended up like he did.
Yes, and I indicate, and I discuss that in the book, there's speculation about the real cause of his death, but I am, we will not end on that note. The note we will end is, here is one who it was important, and you may or may not be familiar with the famous poem of Thomas Gray, his Elegy in the Country Churchyard, whose life shall not be wasted in the desert air. And that is a note that we can end on.
I am so grateful, Dr. Andre, that you were able to spare the time to talk about this book with us again. If you're someone watching this segment, I encourage you to get this book. So many people have sacrificed so much. And even though you or I may not have benefited from that, our sisters and brothers have, because we're all one in the eyes of God. So I encourage you to keep your eye out for when this book is on Amazon, and make sure, if you can, get a copy and read it. It may touch a chord in you, or at the very least teach you something about someone who fought for humanity.
Well, let me thank you, Jennylyn. You're a perfect host. And let me commend you for what you're doing in your own inimitable way. And I think we're all blessed by the work you're doing.
Oh, I am so grateful. Thank you so much. And our timing is perfect.
Wonderful.
I thank you so much for watching Conversations with Jennylyn.
Thank you very much. Have a great evening.
Bring you fascinating people. And I hope that this interview will touch a chord in you and you'll get a copy of the book. And I will
Thank you.
see you next time with another fascinating guest.
Broadcasting from Silicon Valley, California, this is Conversations with Jennylyn.